I never planned to become the woman who sent a waiter to deliver revenge. But when I saw Ethan, my husband of 10 years, leaning across the table, eyes locked with a woman in a red dress, smiling like he'd just discovered happiness, something inside me stopped. Bellissimo wasn't just any restaurant. It was our restaurant. The place he took me to celebrate landing his first big client. Where he first told me he wanted to grow old with me. Now here he was sharing that same booth with a stranger whose laugh echoed like broken glass in my chest. I didn't walk over, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Instead, I asked the waiter for a pen and paper. On a clean white napkin, I wrote, "Enjoy your dinner. I hope it tastes as good as the lie you told me this morning." 15 words, that's all. I folded the note, slipped it to the waiter, and watched from across the room. Ethan opened it, blinked, then froze, his face collapsing in slow motion. He looked around, searching. That's when I stood up. We locked eyes. I lifted my wine glass in a silent toast, 10 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Then I turned and walked away. No scene, no goodbye. Just the truth. Have you ever watched someone lie to your face and knew deep down they believed they'd get away with it? If you've ever chosen silence over screaming, raise your hand in the comments. And if you're ready to hear the whole story, subscribe. Back then, if you had asked me to describe my life in one word, I would have said solid. Not perfect, not flashy, just steady. Ethan and I had built something that looked like a good marriage from the outside. 2 successful people. A house near the lake, date nights, penciled into calendars shared. Spotify playlists, joint tax returns. It wasn't the fairy tale kind of love, but I thought we had evolved beyond that. Mature love, real love, built on years of sacrifices, mutual respect, and carefully negotiated compromises. I was 38. Ethan had just turned 42. We'd been married a decade, and while the passion of our early years had settled into something quieter, I never doubted him. Not really. He kissed me goodbye each morning, texted me around noon with dry little updates about lunch or traffic. And when he came home late, it was always because of clients. I never questioned it. I respected his ambition. But lately, things had begun to hum wrong. I remember the first time I noticed he'd changed his phone password. That quiet click of the screen going black when I walked past. Or the new bottle of cologne that showed up in the bathroom drawer, one I never picked out. He'd started going on more trips, quick ones last minute, always work-related. I told myself not to overthink it. That this was just the ebb and flow of married life. That we were both busy, focused, building something together. Still, the ache in my chest lingered even when I couldn't name its source. Then came that Saturday afternoon. I was walking through the Alderwood Mall, juggling bags of kitchen tiles and hardware samples. We were supposed to be renovating the upstairs bathroom. I stopped for a quick coffee, and that's when Clara spotted me. Clara Hastings, my college roommate, someone I hadn't seen in 2 years. Juliette, she called eyes wide, with something more than surprise. We exchanged quick hugs, the kind you give when you're half-balancing shopping bags and lattes. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And then she said it. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I saw Ethan last night. He was at Bellissimo. Looked like a date. Definitely wasn't alone. Everything around me seemed to tilt. I laughed at first. A short, awkward noise. No, he had a meeting, I said more to myself than to her. She nodded slowly. Maybe so. But he wasn't dressed like a meeting, and he was affectionate. Are you sure? I asked, knowing the answer. Clara had always been the most honest person in any room. I'm sorry, she said softly. I wouldn't have told you if I didn't think you deserved to know. That night, after Ethan left for another mysterious client dinner, I made the call. I dialed the restaurant Bellissimo. I even put a smile in my voice. Hi, I said. I'd just like to confirm a reservation for this evening. Ethan Moore, table for 2. The hostess didn't hesitate. Yes, Mrs. Moore. 8:00 p.m. window seat. Would you like to add any special instructions? I felt like someone had knocked the air out of me. No, that's all. Thank you. I hung up and stared at myself in the hallway mirror. My reflection looked back at me, tired, confused, betrayed. But then I saw it, something flickering underneath the shock. A sharpness, a shift. And just like that, the Juliette who believed every story Ethan told started to disappear. I had no idea what would come next, only that I wouldn't be walking into it blind. Not anymore. And deep down, I think I always knew the real story was just beginning. I arrived at Bellissimo 15 minutes early. The host offered to seat me, but I declined. I'd prefer something more discreet, I said, with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He led me to a table tucked behind one of the carved stone columns, from where I could see the entire dining area, but remain mostly invisible to those not looking for me. It was perfect. Strategic. I sat down and ordered sparkling water. My hands were steady, but only because I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind for the last 3 hours. The black silk dress I wore was one Ethan had never seen, elegant, precise, sharp as a blade. My makeup was flawless. Not a smudge of sorrow. If I was going to watch my husband with another woman, I would not do it looking like a victim. At 8:03 p.m., they walked in. Ethan looked exactly as he had when he left the house that morning. Gray suit, navy tie, hair combed back with the kind of care he rarely bothered with on just a workday. But now I noticed the little things. The way he adjusted his cufflink like he was preparing for a performance. The slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then she appeared. The woman in red, blonde, early 30s, the kind of face that didn't have to work too hard to be beautiful. She laughed softly at something Ethan said and placed a manicured hand on his arm. He guided her with a hand on the small of her back, the exact gesture he once reserved for me. My throat tightened, but I didn't blink. They were seated across the restaurant, just under a hanging chandelier that bathed their table in golden light. They ordered wine. They leaned in close. She laughed again, louder this time. It echoed through my bones. That was when I saw it. The bracelet. Thin, delicate, diamond-studded, glinting under the candlelight. I knew it instantly. I had shown it to Ethan 3 months ago at Tiffany's. He'd smiled, kissed my cheek, and said it was a bit much right now. I'd let it go. And now here it was on her wrist. A business expense, he'd said. A thank you gift for a vendor. My vision narrowed like a tunnel. The pain didn't come as a scream. It came cold, steady, calculated. I raised my hand, signaling my waiter. He appeared promptly. Yes, ma'am, I nodded toward Ethan's table. The man in the blue suit? I'd like to send him something. I paused, then reached for my purse. Not food, just this. From the inner flap, I pulled out a small notepad and pen. I wrote carefully, every word etched in ink, as permanent as the betrayal. Enjoy your dinner. I hope it tastes as good as the lie you told me this morning. I folded it once, slid a $50 bill beneath it, handed both to the waiter. Please give this to him discreetly. Only him. And, if it's not too much to ask, I'd like to see his reaction. The waiter gave a small nod, a flicker of knowing in his eyes. Of course. I watched the scene unfold like a slow-motion film. The waiter approached, placed the note beside Ethan's plate with a quiet, "For you, sir." Ethan looked up puzzled. He unfolded the paper. 3 seconds. That's how long it took. Confusion, recognition, horror. He sat upright, scanning the room like a hunted animal. His lips parted. The woman across from him tilted her head, asking something. He knocked over his water. She reached for him, but he pulled back, still searching. And then, he saw me. I stood slowly. Let him take me in. No tears, no theatrics. Just a woman who now knew. I raised my glass in a silent toast, held his gaze for 10 long, unforgiving seconds. Then I turned, and I walked away. The heel of my shoe echoed softly against the marble floor. The air outside was brisk and smelled faintly of rain. I didn't cry, not yet. I just walked. Because sometimes the most devastating sentence is one that doesn't end with a shout. It ends with a period. And a door closing behind you. Ethan didn't come home that night. I didn't expect him to. I sat alone in the living room, lights off, fireplace cold. Just me and the silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears and seeps into your bones. Midnight came and went. Then 1 hours, 2:30. Still no sound of keys at the door, but my phone buzzed. Again and again. Juliette, please, I need to explain. It's not what it looked like. I made a terrible mistake. I love you. I only love you. They came like a flood, desperate words from a man caught mid-performance. But I didn't reply. I didn't even open most of them. I just let them pile up unread like unanswered prayers. Around 3:15 a.m., I finally stood and wandered into the kitchen. The tile floor was cold under my bare feet. I opened the fridge not looking for anything, just something to do with my hands. My eyes caught a bottle of wine we'd bought together in Napa. We were going to save it for a special night. I left it on the counter. At 6:08 a.m., I heard keys in the lock. I didn't move. I stayed curled up in the armchair like I had all-night blankets still around me, not from warmth, but for armor. Ethan stepped in looking like a man who had aged 5 years in one night. Shirt wrinkled tie, askew hair flattened on one side like he'd slept in a car, or not at all. When he saw me, he froze. "Juliette," he started, voice cracked barely above a whisper. I looked up. "Who is she?" He hesitated. "She's nobody." "Try again." "She's from work. A marketing consultant." "It's not serious." 6 months, I asked. I hadn't said the number out loud before, but the way his face crumbled told me I was right. He nodded. Slowly, shamefully. 6 months. 6 months. That meant last Christmas. The ski trip I planned alone. The surprise birthday dinner I organized while he claimed to be too tired from meetings. The flu I nursed him through in February, while he was texting her from bed, no doubt. I stood slowly. The blanket slid to the floor. "Do you love her?" I asked. His eyes flicked away. That was enough. "Right," I said. The word dropped like a stone. What followed wasn't a fight. Not really. Fights happen when you believe there's still something worth saving. This was a dissection. An autopsy of something long dead. "You've been distant for years," he said suddenly. "Always working late, always somewhere else in your mind. Don't you dare," I said low and sharp. "I built my business without ever forgetting your mother's birthday. I ran spreadsheets and made dinners. I held this house together. I made time. You just didn't want it." He shook his head. "It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You made thousands of tiny choices that led you into her bed. Every one of them was a betrayal. We went on like that, hour after hour, until the sun was fully up and the shadows in the room had shifted. Our marriage was laid bare on the floor between us, stripped of all illusions. By the time he finally said, 'I never meant to hurt you,' it sounded ridiculous. 'That's the worst part,' I replied. 'You didn't think about me enough to even consider whether I'd be hurt. You just didn't care.' That evening he moved into the guest room. We became ghosts in our own house, passing in hallways saying nothing unless absolutely necessary. His footsteps upstairs, mine down below. Two people who once shared everything now orbiting each other like planets, long out of alignment. But I wasn't broken, not anymore. I wasn't looking for apologies or repair. I was studying him, quietly, patiently, watching him unravel, thinking I might still fall apart. But I didn't, because something else had started to form, a plan. There's a strange clarity that comes after the breaking. Once the tears dry, once the questions stop spinning, once you accept the truth, not the version you wanted, but the one sitting across from you in yesterday's suit, lying to your face without even blinking. That's when the silence becomes useful. That's when the real work begins. While Ethan moved through the house like a man waiting for someone else to fix his mess, I watched. I memorized his new habits. What time he left, where he stored his briefcase, how often he still checked his phone, always facing the screen away from me. He didn't know I'd stopped reacting, and that was his first mistake. Because a woman who's no longer screaming is a woman who's observing. One afternoon he left his phone unlocked by accident while showering. I wasn't even trying to snoop. I just wanted to know the name, a simple confirmation. Her name was Sabrina Ellis. She worked in strategy for a tech firm, a firm that sounded familiar. It didn't click until I passed by Ethan's home office and saw a folder open on his desk. Meridian Acquisition Plan. My blood ran cold. Meridian Technologies. That was her company, the company Ethan's firm had been circling for weeks. A major tech acquisition, high stakes, competitive. And now it made sense. She wasn't just his mistress. She was a source. I dug deeper, first gently, then obsessively. Emails, company decks. Hotel receipts filed as executive travel. I found transactions on our joint credit card tagged as business development but traced them to high-end restaurants and luxury hotel suites. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was committing fraud, possibly worse. And the woman helping him had no idea. The deeper I looked, the more deliberate it all seemed. This wasn't emotional drift. This was strategy. Ethan was building his empire with stolen bricks and lying to both of us to hold it together. That's when I called Marcus, my brother, older, cynical, government lawyer at the SEC. Hey, I said as casually as I could, can I ask you something? Hypothetical, he sighed. Juliette, I love you, but if this ends with me needing to testify in court, it's not like that I lied. Uh-huh. Go on. I described the situation vaguely. A financial advisor, insider information, a possible romantic entanglement with an employee at a target firm, use of that information to manipulate acquisition negotiations, corporate funds misused, hidden transactions. Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't even hesitate. If what you're describing is true, he said slowly, this guy's not just in trouble. He's looking at federal charges, securities fraud, misappropriation of company funds. At minimum, he'll lose his license. At worst, jail time. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice level. And if someone wanted to do something with that, you document everything Marcus said. Everything. Dates, names, amounts, save emails, screenshot texts. Don't touch his files, make copies. Quietly, no sudden moves. He paused, then added, and Juliette. Whatever this is, make sure you're protected. Financially, legally, emotionally. Don't burn your life down with him. I hung up, heart racing. That night, while Ethan snored in the guest room, I sat at our kitchen island under the dim pendant lights and opened a new spreadsheet. One tab for expenses, one for contacts, one for timelines, one for lies, because if Ethan thought this was going to end with just a divorce, he hadn't understood the woman he married at all. 2 days later, I messaged the number I'd found in Ethan's phone, the one he saved under the laughable alias vendor contact, ME. I kept it simple. Hi. I think we should talk. Just us. One woman to another. She agreed. We met at a quiet bar inside the Leeward Hotel downtown, somewhere neutral upscale, just impersonal enough to keep the conversation civil. Sabrina arrived 15 minutes late. Her heels clicked across the polished floor as she slid into the booth across from me. She wore black this time. Less revealing than that red dress, but her eyes still held that glint of entitlement. Or maybe it was fear. It's hard to tell when someone's performing for survival. I wasn't sure I should come, she said, signaling for a glass of wine. I thought maybe you wanted to threaten me, or throw a drink in my face. I looked at her calm. Actually, I wanted to thank you. That threw her. For what exactly, she asked, skeptical. For showing me who Ethan really is, before I wasted any more time on him. She shifted in her seat, clearly unsettled. He told me, you two were separated. I nodded. Of course he did. Let me guess. Separate bedrooms, just waiting for the right time to file. Her silence told me I was right. Did he also tell you we renewed our vows last year, I added. That we were planning a trip to Lake Como this spring, that he bought me a necklace that matches the bracelet you're wearing. Her wineglass trembled slightly as she lifted it. He lied to both of us, Sabrina. The only difference is I'm done believing him. She stared at me for a moment. Why are you telling me all this? You could just hate me and walk away. I don't hate you, I said. I think you were manipulated just like I was. Only you didn't know there was someone else. Her lips pressed together. He said you were cold, distant, obsessed with your career. I gave a tired smile. And you believed him. She looked away. I leaned in slightly, voice steady. Did you know the merger Ethan's planning, the acquisition of Meridian Technologies? Her eyes snapped back to mine. Yeah. He said it was his firm's biggest deal yet, that it could change everything for him. It will, I said. Especially once the SEC finishes reviewing the materials I sent them. Sabrina paled. When I opened my bag and slid a manila envelope across the table, just enough for her to see the headers, the email subjects, the receipts. I've seen the documents. I've seen the messages. He's been using your access to confidential company data for months, framing it as pillow talk, romantic banter. That's not possible, she whispered. Voice cracking. He wouldn't, he would. And he did. She looked sick. I'm not here to ruin your life, Sabrina. I'm here to give you a choice. You can bury this, pretend he cares about you, and go down with him. Or, I placed my card beside the envelope. You can help fix what he's broken. For you. For your job. For the people at Meridian who have no idea they're pawns in his game. She stared at the card like it might burn her fingers. I need to think, she murmured. Take all the time you need, I said, standing. But not too much. He's counting on your silence. As I walked away, I heard her exhale a sharp, broken sound that said, maybe, just maybe, she finally understood what kind of man Ethan Moore really was. And I walked out lighter than I'd felt in weeks, because I hadn't just confronted the mistress. I'd turned the first key in unlocking everything. 3 nights after our meeting at the Leeward, I got a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the corner booth. 6 p.m. Come alone. Sabrina. I didn't hesitate. She was already seated when I arrived, wineglass in hand, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she slid a USB drive across the table. Then a folded folder, tightly clipped, heavy with implication. I didn't know, she said quietly. Not about the stock manipulation, not that he was using me like a device. I nodded, accepting it, not just the documents, but her humanity. Inside the folder, email threads between Ethan and Sabrina. Internal documents she had access to. Documents she never should have shared. A voice recording of Ethan suggesting she pull the forecast early from Meridian's servers. Even a draft press release she'd helped him rewrite to match false projections. It wasn't just cheating, it was espionage. Federal, criminal. I left the bar that night with more than proof. I left with leverage. That same evening, I met Rachel Linwood for drinks. Rachel, my college roommate, was now one of the most feared divorce attorneys in King County, and also thankfully still someone who'd once stayed up with me all night in our dorm room, listening to Nora Jones and reading Sylvia Plath. We barely touched our wine. You need 3 things, Rachel said, flipping open her leather planner. Protection, documentation, patience. I already have the evidence, I replied. Sabrina came through. Rachel smirked. Even better. But there's more. Financial forensics. Timeline construction. And for God's sake, Juliette, do not move out of the house. I blinked. I thought that would make things easier. It makes it harder for property division. Staying in the home puts you in stronger position. He doesn't know what you know. Let's keep it that way. She leaned forward. Juliette, he will try to charm his way out of this, into leniency, into keeping everything. But if what you've told me is true, this isn't a marital squabble. This is a corporate bomb waiting to detonate. I exhaled. I'm ready, I said. Good, Rachel replied. Then it's time to build a case that doesn't just win, it ends him. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to sleep. My laptop open, my phone charged. A new email address created unlinked to our joint accounts. I began forwarding files, photos of receipts, screenshots of messages, investment accounts he'd never told me about. And one by one, I started building what Rachel called a nuclear folder. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about integrity, about power, about finally telling the full truth, all of it. I backed everything up onto 2 encrypted drives. One I locked in a safety box at the bank. The other I gave to Marcus when he dropped by the house 2 days later under the guise of bringing me Thai food. He barely said a word, just nodded, took the drive and said, "If this ever goes public, you'll be 10 steps ahead." It was the first time I'd truly felt safe in weeks. Ethan, meanwhile, was getting nervous. I could see it in the way he watched me in the kitchen, pretending to read while his eyes followed me. In the way he asked if I wanted to talk, suggested we maybe see a counselor. I played my part, smiled lightly, made tea, answered in short sentences. Because he thought I was still reeling. He thought I was still trying to decide whether to forgive him. But what I was really doing was preparing the kind of silence that ends careers. And Ethan Moore had no idea just how loud that silence was about to become. The quarterly board meeting of Moore Wealth Advisory was scheduled for a Tuesday. Rain tapped against the glass that morning, as if nature itself knew something was coming. Ethan was up early, humming to himself as he adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. He wore his lucky tie, navy blue with a subtle silver stripe, the one he always put on when he needed to look invincible. I kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Good luck today," I said. He looked surprised but pleased. "Thanks. It really means a lot, considering everything," I smiled. "Well, this is a big day for you. I wouldn't want to miss it." His smile faltered slightly. "Miss it? You're not. Wait. You're coming. I have a few errands first," I replied softly, already walking out the door. "I'll meet you there." I arrived at Moore Wealth headquarters 15 minutes before the meeting began. Tailored black suit, hair smooth parted with precision. I wasn't the supportive wife today. I was something else entirely. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. "Mrs. Moore, it's been a while," I smiled. "I believe the board is expecting me." "No need for escort," I added gently. I still remember the way. The boardroom was already half full. Ethan stood at the head of the table, briefing the company's general counsel. His eyes found me, and for a brief moment, something flickered. Confusion, discomfort. He crossed the room quickly, whispering just under his breath. "What are you doing here?" "Supporting my husband," I said aloud with just enough volume for those nearby to hear. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." He clenched his jaw. "Juliette, not now." "Whatever you're planning, I'm just here to observe," I replied steady. "Unless there's something you don't want me to see." Before he could answer, the chairman tapped his gavel. "Let's begin." The first 45 minutes passed in a blur of charts, projections, financial jargon. I sat quietly in the second row. Back straight, legs crossed at the ankle. A few board members nodded politely in my direction, likely wondering why the CEO's wife had suddenly reappeared after years of polite absence. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood confidently, clicker in hand, and launched into his grand vision. The Meridian acquisition, he began, is not just a strategic move, it's our moment. Our chance to step into a new market ahead of competition with insider precision, he went on. Slide after slide. Projected earnings, market behavior, privileged insight. I almost smiled at that line. As he finished, the chairman turned to the room. "Impressive. Before we open the floor for questions, Mrs. Moore has requested a few minutes to address the board as a significant shareholder." Ethan froze, what he hissed, lips barely moving. I stood walking slowly toward the front with my laptop in hand. "Thank you, Richard," I said, voice steady. "Before this board considers any binding resolution involving Meridian Technologies, I believe it's important to review additional information." I connected my laptop to the main screen. The first slide lit up, subject Ethan Moore, unauthorized communications. The room fell silent. What followed wasn't theatrical, it was methodical. Emails, texts, dinner receipts. Sabrina's voice in one clipped recording, asking Ethan if pulling the quarterly report early would raise suspicion. And finally, the kicker, a document from Meridian's secured server, bearing both Ethan's comments and Sabrina's login metadata. "I have submitted this full dossier to the SEC," I concluded. "This morning at 8 a.m., gasps. The general counsel leaned forward, face pale. "These are very serious allegations, Mrs. Moore." "They're not allegations," I replied. "They're facts, verifiable. And I believe this board has a responsibility to act before Ethan's recklessness exposes all of you to criminal liability." Ethan stood, voice trembling. "This is absurd. She's doing this because our marriage was a lie." I interrupted calmly. "Possibly, but this is bigger than us." The room remained still for a heartbeat. Then one board member spoke. "I move that we suspend all action on the Meridian deal pending a full investigation." Seconded, another said immediately. The chairman nodded grimly. "Mr. Moore, we need you to step out." Ethan turned to me, hatred etched across his face. "You think you've won," he whispered. I didn't answer. I just handed the general counsel a sealed envelope. "This contains full documentation. You'll want to review it quickly. The SEC won't wait." As I left the room, heels clicking against the polished floor, I felt nothing but quiet power. Because revenge doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it just needs a microphone, a projector. And the truth. Ethan didn't come after me when I left the boardroom, but I saw him standing in the hallway, eyes blazing, jaw tight. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed as I walked past him. "Was this your plan all along? To humiliate me, to ruin me?" I stopped, turned slowly, met his stare without blinking. "No, Ethan," I said, voice low. "You did that all on your own. I just made sure you couldn't take the rest of us down with you." He scoffed, but it sounded weak. "They'll never prove anything." I tilted my head slightly, almost pitying him. "Vanessa kept records, all of them. She's already cooperating." His eyes flared panic, not anger. "And Ethan?" I added, taking one step closer, "check your email." I didn't need to see his face to know what that meant. My lawyer had already sent over the divorce filing, the formal terms, the asset division, the non-negotiables. I walked away. I didn't look back. The sun had started to break through the gray Seattle sky as I stepped outside, warming my face for the first time in weeks. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine and sat alone on my new apartment balcony, watching the ferries move slowly across Puget Sound. The headlines came fast. Moore Advisory CEO under federal investigation. Meridian merger halted amid espionage scandal. Vanessa Ellis cooperates with SEC in fraud case. I didn't read them all. I didn't need to. The divorce was finalized within 6 months. I took what was mine. No more, no less. A portion of our shared assets. Ownership stake in the firm. Freedom. Ethan, meanwhile, became a shadow of the man he used to be. Aging overnight. Disgraced. Pending trial. No more suits. No more speeches. Just silence. One day I wrote a letter, not to mail, just to write. Ethan, I don't hate you anymore. That would mean I still carry you with me. I don't. What you did broke our marriage, but it also broke an illusion I needed to outgrow. Thank you for forcing me to find myself. I hope someday you understand what love really is. Not control, not secrecy, not performance. It's truth. And I finally found it in myself. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of my drawer, and returned to the balcony. Above me, the sky was darkening, but not with storm, just stars. And for the first time in years, I was finally excited to see what would come next. What did you think of Juliette's silence? If you were in her shoes, would you have stood up or walked away? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe Juliette made the right move, vote Tamar 1. If you'd have taken a different path, vote Tamar 7. Don't forget to subscribe to EN Reddit Story, where real justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply writes a note and walks away.